The line between feeling permanently stuck and finally becoming financially dangerous is much thinner than most people believe. For many people, it is not $1 million. It is not even $100,000. It is the first $15,000 that truly belongs to them. I have watched people spend half their lives chasing the wrong milestone. They imagine wealth begins when the salary gets big enough, when the right stock doubles, or when some lucky break finally arrives. That is not how it usually works. Wealth begins much earlier than that. It begins the moment a person is no longer one flat tire, one emergency room bill, one broken furnace, or one ugly month at work away from going backward. That is the first real turn. I want to be very clear about something. $15,000 is not riches. It will not put you on the cover of a magazine. It will not buy a yacht, a vacation home, or the kind of lifestyle people perform on social media. But it does something far more important. It changes the direction of force in your life. Before that point, nearly everything is pushing against you. After that point, a few things finally start pushing with you. Most people, they quit in the most discouraging phase. They quit in the flat, ugly, humiliating stage where effort is real, sacrifice is real, and visible progress still looks insultingly small. That is where the battle is actually won. I have seen people with ordinary salaries build solid fortunes, and I have seen people with dazzling incomes stay fragile for decades. The public likes to make money sound mysterious. It usually is not. Most of the time it is arithmetic, behavior, and endurance. The arithmetic is simple. The behavior is hard. The endurance is where most people fail. Years ago, I met a man who thought he had a spending problem. What he really had was a discouragement problem. He was in his early 40s, had a normal job, no trust fund, no big inheritance, and no dramatic rescue coming. He had been trying to save for years. But every time the account reached a few $1,000s, life took it back. A car repair, a dental bill, a stretch of reduced hours. His savings never felt like capital. It felt like temporary parking. That distinction matters. Temporary parking does not change your behavior, capital does. He said something to me I have never forgotten. He said, "I feel like money never stays long enough to start helping." That sentence contains the experience of millions of people. They are not always irresponsible. They are often simply below the level where money begins to change their options, below that line. Every dollar has a job and no backup above that line. Some dollars begin to stand guard while others go to work. That is a totally different world. When I was young, I learned a lesson that stayed with me. A small amount of capital behaves very differently from no capital, and a meaningful amount of capital behaves very different. The first serious pile does not need to be glamorous. It only needs to be large enough to alter the mathematics of your life and the psychology of your decisions. For a great many households, that first meaningful pile is about $15,000. Not because the number is magical, because around that point, several things start happening at once. You stop being financially naked. You stop panicking over every surprise. You begin to see returns that are large enough to notice. You begin to qualify for opportunities you could not touch before. And perhaps most importantly, you stop seeing yourself as someone who can never get ahead. People underestimate the power of that identity shift. A person who has never held on to meaningful savings does not merely lack money. He often lacks proof that discipline works, proof that he can defer pleasure and keep the reward, proof that he can build a reserve and not immediately watch it disappear. Until that proof exists, every plan feels theoretical. Once that proof exists, the whole internal conversation changes. Now let me show you why the first stretch feels so thankless. Suppose a household manages to save $300 every 2 weeks. That sounds respectable when you say it quickly. It is not easy to do. It requires skipped purchases, delayed upgrades, fewer indulgences, and the ability to watch other people spend money more freely than you do. Over a year, that kind of saving produces roughly $7,800. At the end of that first year, nobody feels rich. The account may not even look impressive. In fact, if the person expected to feel transformed, he may feel insulted by the result. That is where most bad decisions begin. He starts comparing the sacrifice to the visible payoff. The sacrifice feels enormous. The visible payoff feels small. So he concludes the method does not work. That conclusion is one of the costliest mistakes in personal finance. The early stage is not weak because the method is broken. The early stage is weak because you are still carrying almost the entire load yourself. Your labor is doing the work. Your money is not yet strong enough to matter much. That is normal. That is not failure. That is the entrance fee. A great many people think linearly about a process that eventually becomes nonlinear. They look at a small first-year result and imagine the future as a long, boring extension of that same pace. That is how people talk themselves out of the very process that could have rescued them. They say, if this is all I have after a year, then what is the point? The point is that the first hill is never supposed to feel rewarding. The first hill is where you prove you can climb. Once a person reaches $15,000, the account is still modest, but it stops being meaningless. That is the key. At that level, the returns on the money begin to matter emotionally and practically. The first few $100s of annual return may not change your tax bracket, but it changes how you see the machine. You no longer feel as if you alone are dragging the entire wagon. You begin to see that capital can contribute. That is the first turning point. And it is not merely mathematical. It is psychological. Before $15,000, a setback can erase momentum. After $15,000, a setback may still hurt, but it does not always erase the whole project. You feel exposed. After $15,000, you feel buffered. Before $15,000, opportunities often pass because you simply cannot participate. After $15,000, at least a few doors start opening. That opening matters more than people realize. I have seen people miss excellent opportunities, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they lacked ready capital, but helpless. That is a painful combination. Imagine a good business owner needing a little growth capital. Imagine a market panic presenting attractive prices. Imagine a used vehicle tool set or equipment package that would immediately improve your earning power. Imagine a chance to move to a better apartment, eliminate toxic debt, or handle a crisis without borrowing at ugly interest rates. People talk about freedom as though it begins with extravagance. It often begins with simply having enough cash to choose instead of beg. That is what the first meaningful reserve does. It converts desperation into option value, and option value is one of the finest assets on earth. The man I mentioned earlier eventually crossed the line. Nothing theatrical happened on that day. There was no orchestra. There was no cheering crowd. He did not suddenly become a different class of citizen. But a month later, his transmission failed, and for the first time in years, the repair did not send him backwards. That may not sound like a triumph to someone who has never lived close to the edge. It is a tremendous triumph, because poverty is not merely low income. Poverty is a condition in which every surprise has the power to shove you off the road. The reserve changed that. Then another thing happened because he was no longer living with the same panic. He began thinking better. This is one of the least discussed realities in money. Scarcity does not merely shrink your bank account. It shrinks your time horizon. It shortens your emotional fuse. It makes every decision feel urgent. Urgent people make expensive decisions. Calmer people usually make better ones. The reserve did not make him rich. It made him less breakable. And once a person is less breakable, compounding has a chance to matter. That is why I keep returning to this threshold. Not because $15,000 ends the journey, because it begins a different journey. Now, there are several forces that keep people from ever crossing it. The first is impatience. Impatience is far more destructive than most people think. A person can understand saving. He can agree with all the principles. He can even begin with genuine enthusiasm. Then 6 months pass. The account is better, but not dramatic. A year passes, the account is respectable, but not life-changing, and he begins to itch. He wants proof sooner, he wants reward sooner. He wants a visible difference between his disciplined life and the noisier, easier lives around him. That is when impatience whispers all the old lies. You work hard, you deserve something. You can always start again next month. One purchase will not matter. One trip will not matter. One stretch of careless spending will not matter. Then the account gets cut in half or emptied, and the person says life simply got in the way. Usually what got in the way was not life. It was the inability to survive delayed gratification. Compounding rewards the person who can tolerate a period in which the effort feels out of proportion to the visible payoff. That tolerance is rare. The second destroyer is envy. Envy is a silent tax people impose on themselves. A family can have a decent plan, a clean budget, and real forward progress. Then they look sideways. A neighbor buys a larger vehicle. A colleague moves into a more expensive house. A relative posts vacation photos from a place nobody in the family can pronounce. Suddenly, the plan that was working begins to feel humiliating. Nothing in their own arithmetic changed. Only the comparison changed. That is enough to wreck many people. Envy is especially foolish because it rarely compares truth to truth. It compares your balance sheet to someone else's theater. You do not know their interest rate. You do not know their revolving credit. You do not know what private pressure sits behind their public display. But envy does not ask questions. It simply makes sensible restraint feel like failure. That is lethal. If you are serious about getting past the first $15,000, you must become almost indifferent to what other people appear to be doing. A person who is always measuring his life against somebody else's display is handing away both his peace and his future. The third destroyer is self-pity. I want to say this gently, but I want to say it clearly. Self-pity is financially expensive. There are people with genuine disadvantages. They start lower, they earn less, they carry family burdens other people do not see. Some have made mistakes, some were dealt difficult cards. All of that can be true. Self-pity still makes things worse. It drains initiative. It turns planning into complaint. It makes a person rehearse his limitations until they become an identity. Once that happens, almost every sacrifice feels pointless because the mind has already decided the future will not be different. That is no way to build anything. I have never seen self-pity improve a balance sheet. I have seen it justify thousands of bad decisions. If your start is hard, acknowledge it. If your wages are low, acknowledge it. If your path will be slower than someone else's, acknowledge it. Then get back to arithmetic. Arithmetic is often kinder than emotion. Emotion tells people they are trapped. Arithmetic often shows that a careful person can still crawl into strength. One disciplined month at a time. The fourth destroyer is leverage. This one deserves extra attention because it ruins precisely the people who have finally begun making progress. Many savers reach $8,000, $10,000, or $12,000 and then get impatient. The process has been slow. They feel close enough to taste the milestone. Then someone offers the shortcut, borrow to invest, use margin, finance the jump. Take a little risk so the progress finally speeds up. That is the part of the movie where many careful people lose the script. Leverage is seductive because it feels like intelligence wearing a suit. It is usually impatience in a necktie. When borrowed money works, people feel brilliant. When borrowed money turns, it does not merely reduce progress. It can erase years. The beauty of reaching your first meaningful reserve, the slow way, is that it stays yours. Nobody calls it back. Nobody marks it down overnight because a lender changed its mood. You do not need to get rich 4 times. You need to get there once and remain there. That means respecting fragility. The 5th destroyer is complexity. The financial world loves complexity because complexity is profitable to sell. Ordinary people should be very suspicious whenever someone makes basic progress sound too sophisticated to understand. The foundations of wealth are not glamorous. Spend less than you earn, build a reserve, avoid high-interest poison, keep learning, increase your usefulness. Buy productive assets when you can understand them. Stay in the game long enough for time to help. That is not a sexy speech. It is a very effective one. Now, let me tell you what I think people should focus on once they accept that $15,000 matters. First, stop chasing motivation and build a system. Motivation is a weather pattern. Systems survive bad moods. A family that saves only when it feels inspired will not save long. A family that automates saving, tracks leakage, and decides in advance where each dollar goes has something much stronger than enthusiasm. It has structure. Structure is what carries people through ordinary Tuesdays, not grand speeches. If the account must grow, the savings need to happen before the day gets a chance to argue with you. That is why automatic transfers matter. That is why a separate savings location matters. That is why rules matter. When I look at successful people, I do not mostly see motivational superiority. I see better default behavior. Second, understand that income matters, but usefulness matters more. A person I do not make enough to save may be partially right today and still completely wrong about tomorrow. Saving is half the game, becoming more valuable is the other half. That means reading more than the average person, learning more than the average person, becoming more reliable than the average person, being the one who follows through, being the one people trust, being the one whose judgment improves. Term earning power rises for people who become steady, capable, and easier to depend on. The market does not always reward brilliance first. Very often it rewards usefulness. A modest worker who keeps upgrading his usefulness creates room to save more. A person who never upgrades usefulness keeps trying to solve a long-term problem with a short-term budget. Third, treat high-interest debt like a house fire. People do not build wealth while carrying expensive consumer debt as a lifestyle. They tread water while paying admission to their own stagnation. A person can claim to be investing for the future, but if a credit card is quietly charging predatory rates in the background, the arithmetic is often working against him. It is difficult to build forward motion when a hidden leak is draining the tank. Fourth, learn to separate looking rich from getting rich. These two activities often point in opposite directions. Looking rich is immediate, it is visible, it gets social rewards, it can be photographed. Getting rich is quieter. It often looks unimpressive in the beginning. It may require driving the plain car, wearing the ordinary watch, skipping the status upgrade, and letting the outside world underestimate what is happening. That is a good trade. The market does not pay extra because you seem successful during the accumulation phase. The market pays the person who preserved capital and let time operate. When I learned that deferred gratification feels lonely only until it starts producing visible results. After that, it becomes self-reinforcing. That is one reason the $15,000 line matters so much. Before it, discipline feels lonely. After it, discipline begins to send evidence back. The account is no longer just a promise. It is becoming a partner. That partnership grows slowly at first. then it grows faster, then much faster. And here is another point I want people to understand. The first meaningful reserve does not only help you invest, it helps you negotiate. A person with nothing in reserve must say yes too often, yes to bad timing, yes to poor terms, yes to unhealthy work, because a gap in income is too frightening. Yes to decisions made under pressure. A person with some reserve can breathe. Breathing room is economic power. It may not feel dramatic, but it changes your posture toward the world. You become less likely to accept the first bad deal simply because you are scared. That is valuable. Sometimes the real return on a reserve is not the interest. It is the stupidity avoided. Now let me connect this to the wider environment, because I do not think people are entering an especially forgiving period. When debt builds across a society for too long, eventually the environment becomes less kind to the weak, the leveraged, and the unprepared. That does not mean everyone needs to panic. It does mean that resilience deserves a premium. If capital becomes tighter, if refinancing becomes harder, if asset prices become more volatile, then households with no reserve will experience every shock more intensely. Households with a reserve will not be immune, but they will have room to respond. That room can become decisive. People like to imagine that opportunity appears in clean, obvious form. Often it appears wrapped in chaos, a panic, a recession, a temporary collapse in good assets, a temporary sale on long-term quality. The people who benefit are rarely the loudest people. They are the liquid people. They are the people who crossed the threshold before conditions got ugly. That is why preparation matters most before the crowd feels urgency. When fear becomes obvious, prices have already moved and courage becomes more expensive. The family that waits to build a reserve until conditions are frightening is trying to buy insurance after the smoke has started. That is not impossible. It is simply much harder. There is a sentence I would like more people to carry around in their heads. Do not try to be impressive. Try to become unbreakable. That single shift removes a tremendous amount of foolishness. A person trying to be impressive buys signals. A person trying to become unbreakable builds reserves. A person trying to be impressive borrows against the future. A person trying to become unbreakable protects the future. A person trying to be impressive wants to look like wealth has already arrived. A person trying to become unbreakable understands that the early stage is supposed to look plain. Plain is fine. Plain survives. Now let me tell you what frequently happens after a person reaches the first $15,000. He becomes tempted to celebrate prematurely. This is understandable and dangerous. The account finally looks large enough to feel real, and the mind starts spending it before the body does. A better apartment, a better vehicle, a reward purchase, a signal to the world that the drought is over. That is the moment when disciplined people accidentally delay their own freedom. The first reserve is not there to announce success. It is there to strengthen the machine. Once you have crossed the line, the smartest move is usually to protect the structure that got you there. Keep expenses flatter than your ego wants. Keep saving. Keep increasing usefulness. Keep reading. Keep waiting for the first reserve to become a second reserve, then a third. That is when the curve begins to tilt in your favor. At $30,000, the machine is stronger. At $50,000, it feels more real. At $75,000, many people discover that their capital has started contributing enough to change the whole emotional experience of work, risk, and time. That is why surviving the first stage matters so much. Nobody reaches the faster phase without first enduring the dull phase. Nobody gets the later beauty of compounding without first tolerating the early ugliness of compounding. That is the contract. People want the second half without signing the first half. Life does not offer that arrangement. Another thing people should remember is that wealth is not only about rate of return, it is about rate of retention. I have seen perfectly smart people earn well and keep almost nothing. They confuse capacity to spend with capacity to build. Those are different capacities. A person who earns more but allows expenses to expand just as fast is often running in place while appearing impressive. Meanwhile, someone with a smaller income but greater discipline is quietly building a fortress brick by brick. Outwardly, the second person may look less successful for years. Inwardly, the second person is moving toward freedom. And freedom is the whole point. The point is not merely owning more things. The point is being able to make decisions with less fear. The point is not having to sell at the worst possible time. The point is not having to tolerate every form of nonsense because there is no cash buffer between you and the next crisis. The point is not luxury first. The point is sovereignty first. A person with even modest reserves starts reclaiming sovereignty. That is a beautiful thing. Now, whenever I talk this way, some people object and say the threshold is arbitrary. To a degree, of course, it is. Every household is different. Every city is different. Every level of fixed expense is different. I understand that. But a good threshold is not useful because it is metaphysically perfect. It is useful because it is behaviorally concrete. People need a visible first mountain. A person who hears only vague talk about long-term wealth may drift. A person who says, "My first serious objective is $15,000 of clean reserve and invested capital," now has a target that can shape behavior. Targets matter. They create seriousness. They make trade-offs visible. They force decisions into the present. You cannot reach a concrete line with abstract intentions. You must change habits. You must guard the inflow. You must reduce the leakages. You must stop using mood as a budget. You must stop using envy as a shopping list. You must stop treating every minor stress as permission to blow up your plan. That is real adulthood in finance. It is not complicated. It is simply difficult. The world keeps trying to convince people that small, patient disciplines are too boring to matter. History says otherwise, in markets, in business, and in life. The boring disciplines are often the ones that determine who has staying power. The dramatic move gets attention. The repeated move builds results. If I were speaking to a young person with little money, I would not begin by asking which stock might triple. I would ask different questions. How much can you save automatically every month without renegotiating with yourself? What skills are you building that will raise your usefulness in future earnings? What debt is quietly sabotaging you? What recurring spending exists only to soothe emotion or signal status? How much time are you wasting on comparison? How many years are you losing because you want visible progress too quickly? Those questions matter more than the clever market question in the beginning, because until the machine is built, the machine cannot help you. And the machine begins with retained capital. That is why I believe the first $15,000 deserves more respect than it gets. It is the first layer of real stability. It is the first proof that your behavior can produce protection. It is the first time money begins serving as more than a It is the point where opportunities become more visible and emergencies become less fatal. It is where patience first starts receiving enough evidence to remain patient. And for many people, it is the first time the future stops looking like a straight line of strain. Once you have that, the next objective is not to become flashy. It is to become consistent. Consistency has built more wealth than excitement ever will. If you save, learn, avoid poison, resist envy, refuse self-pity, keep leverage from hijacking your judgment, and stay in the game long enough for your capital to mature, a surprising thing happens. The world stops feeling like a place that is always happening to you. It starts feeling like a place in which you can finally move with some force of your own. That does not happen all at once. It happens gradually. Then suddenly enough to notice. That is the nature of compounding. The early phase insults your ego. The later phase rewards your endurance. So if you are below $15,000 today, Do not misunderstand the flatness of the path. Flat does not mean broken. Quiet does not mean useless. Slow does not mean hopeless. It simply means you are still in the part where character is carrying the entire load. That part matters. Stay with it. Build the system. Protect the reserve. Increase your usefulness. Ignore the theater around you. Let other people play the status game if they want to. Your job is different. Your job is to cross the line where money stops being only effort and starts becoming reinforcement. Once that happens, you are not finished, but you are no longer starting from zero in the ways that matter most. And that is where real wealth, the kind that gives a person dignity, patience, and room to choose, finally begins.